Thank you so much for having me. My name is Jordan Meehan. I am running for state rep here in Allston, Brighton in the 17th Suffolk District. Really excited to chat with you today and answer some questions. Yeah, so I'm running really to help build a moral and just Commonwealth, to fix the things that have been broken long before the COVID-19 crisis laid bare these gaps in our social safety net. I'm running because the cost of housing has skyrocketed, and it's time to take the power back from these big, abusive corporate landlords and big developers. A few months ago, we asked people, how would your life be different if you didn't have to worry about a drastic rent increase? And people said like they would have a savings account, they would plan for the future, would think about having kids, would go to grad school, would simply spend less time worrying and doing the things that they loved. I'm running because we need rent control, increased tenant protections, zoning reform, and social housing to guarantee housing as a human right. I'm running to ensure that public transit is treated as a public good and to ensure that it's fair, free for all users. When I was young, I was living in Malden, and access to the MBTA brought me to so many experiences that shaped me as a person. And I'm running because every child deserves that kind of access to opportunity. I'm running because the science only gives us 10 years to take drastic action on climate change. And I understand the necessity of passing a Green New Deal for Massachusetts, but apparently the State House does not, because the last climate bill they passed in 2018 won't get us to 100% renewable energy until 2095, and that's climate denial, and that's unacceptable. There is a lot, as you know. I think some of the biggest issues of the State House right now, we have a very conservative leadership team, a very conservative speaker, and they enforce a very strict top-down structure that really shuts out a lot of progressive voices, both in the building and on the outside. Um, and with that brings this very stark unwillingness to really hear out progressive ideas and this just breathtaking deference to our Republican governor. With supermajorities in both chambers of the State House, you would think the Democrats would be willing to push for progressive ideals in such a progressive state with a progressive voting populace, but they don't listen to people. Yeah, so I think that comes down to like three big things. Building progressive power on the inside, making sure that our constituents are more informed, and building activist power on the outside to bear down on the inside. So with respect to progressive power on the inside, like I said, we need much more new progressives in the State House. That means electing more up and down the ballot, and just to build out a more cohesive, unified progressive bloc that can stand for roll call, that can force votes on transparency issues and push back against these institutional barriers. That's by and large a numbers game at this point, because we don't really have the numbers on the inside right now to force roll call votes. Beyond that, we need to be much more intentional and creative about informing our constituents and becoming more accessible. I think one of the upsides, at least, of this pandemic is everyone knows how to use Zoom, and everyone knows how to make themselves more available digitally. I think as a digital native and a young person who's like grew up on the internet, I'm much more adept at these things and can get more creative with constituent outreach and services. I've also seen, like, this is kind of like old fashioned, but I've seen a lot of really creative newsletters from people who are elected that give these detailed explainers on their votes. Michelle Wu is actually a really good example of this with her council notes that she gives out, I think, every week. They're very detailed, but still somehow succinct, and like it's not overwhelming. It's very digestible. Third, building activist power on the outside. I come from the activist base. I'm a longtime climate activist. I have been rabble-rousing for climate change for many, many years and trying to get people elected. Before I ran for this seat, I was the chair of Sierra Club's endorsement committee. So I forced the issue of environmental justice on a lot of candidates to inform them and put them on the record. A lot of reasons. I think we have a long-standing hostile culture to primary challengers. We saw that pretty starkly in 2018 when Ayanna Pressley ran for Congress against Mike Capuano. People wrote the idea off as ludicrous, and it was belittling, without even giving due consideration to why someone would challenge an incumbent. Like, there were very, very good reasons. So I think we are chipping away at that culture bit by bit. I'm hoping that we'll do much more on that this year. Beyond that, there's this assumption that Mass, since it's a deep blue state, it must be a progressive state. And we are a blue state, but in terms of our elections and our leadership structure and in our elected officials, we are by no means a progressive state. It's also very difficult to know how our legislators vote on things and to gauge what their record is, which has been a very intentional policy choice on their behalf. So that has really made it very difficult to have a more informed electorate. And when you don't know how your rep votes on things, it's very difficult to gauge, is it worth supporting a challenger? Is it worth running? Standing for roll call as often as possible, especially on big pieces of legislation like this police reform bill. That should include roll call on amendments, because there are so many that are important that get withdrawn or that get voted on in the dead of night that can go, forgotten about if you're not being very intentional on recording everything. Um, Other states have such easier and more advanced ways of just recording all of this, be that from like recording all their sessions to their votes to their hearings. And it makes us, by comparison, look like a technological backwater. We have seen, just, I'll give you an example of what happens in Allston over the past couple months. Every Wednesday, the Brazilian Worker Center in Allston on Harvard Ave, around the corner from my apartment, becomes a food bank. And that is, they have lines that last for hours that wrap around the block. And the people in these lines are by and large undocumented immigrants that have been left out of the federal and state response packages to COVID-19. And that didn't happen by accident. That was an intentional policy choice, an intentional act of policy violence against the poor, against the marginalized, against the undocumented, in the worst public health crisis of our time. And these are populations that are being hit with health impacts from pollution that have given rise to higher infection and death rates. And then we have cut them out of our response rate as a political intentional choice. And that is a moral outrage. So I think bringing to bear the lived experience of people that we represent and bringing that to bear in the State House as storytelling, as testimony, and making that testimony live and public to make sure that everyone has the ability to know what happens in these deliberations is a massive way of breaking this power imbalance as a rep. And if we can do that with a much more unified progressive bloc, to bring in these stories, to make them public, that changes the narrative. Bring people in. Bring people from the district into the State House. If you want to mess with someone's district, tell that to your constituents. Bring them in. There's no reason to not, make the public argument for what's happening on the inside and bringing public pressure to bear on the inside. That also boils down to having a public hearing process, and having that recorded and broadcasted. Just not really a willingness right now. I'm not seeing a willingness from so many reps to, be public about the entire budget process and articulating the ways in which it impacts their districts, and unless like they have won something in a final budget and they want to brag about it. But you don't see this public discourse around like what's being debated and how that impacts your district. So if you want to threaten budget cuts to this district, I will gladly bring in a bunch of families that are going to be impacted by that, and you can tell it to their face and we can have that fight. I'm not going in alone, like absolutely not.